I should make a recording of this before I forget it, because I'm about to do some new research into other things. So before I forget this point, is that in metatype, the superego's death or the ego's sin, essentially the fundamental structural problem of the false ego complex is essentially that object essentially is not being shared by the superego. So because it's merely sort of casting a shadow against the ego, and it exclusively is enslaved in some sense, it is the foundation of the superego first and nothing else, and then it casts a shadow against the ego. So in some sense, relative to the inferior function in the ego, it's an insurmountable obstacle in some sense. And it's sort of the crumbling of that obstacle, which in some sense is the proof of the transcendence of the ego. And the opening up of the resources of the superego is essentially through the foundation, through the ego sin, which is the superego's death. And so the superego's death probably wasn't even experienced as a death before the subconscious fully emerged or was developed enough to have an independent sense of itself, which in some sense implies also that the ego was established along enough that it could experience the other side of the superego's foundation or the superego's death. It could see it as the ego's sin. It perceived the superego's death as the ego's sin. And because it could see that from the other side, the subconscious then had an independent existence distinct from the superego. And that's when the game began, essentially, when the resources of the superego became disjointed or dispirited, it became distinct from the subconscious. So in the early naive phase of development, and the subconscious is accessible to the superego, life is oceanic. You have this dream-like quality to existence. But when the ego is finally sort of bootstrapped enough for the subconscious to and also then maybe this is slightly speculative, that the subconscious and the ego then simultaneously are instead looking for what was provided to the subconscious from the superego is instead being unfolded or discovered in the unconscious. So the unconscious becomes the indirect access to the superego. And the investigation into the unconscious is the substitution of the superego. But that this stand-in some sense, is you are playing the game, and the game master is the superego in some sense. The superego becomes isolated, but also a kind of predominant background environmental procedural aspect, a quasi god of the world, or maybe that is better understood as the spirit of man as well. But and the integration of which is something like precipitating the Son of Man from the Spirit of Man to then also be the Son of God, which is in some sense the authority which the ego, within its propositional framing of things, but also obviously that comes part and parcel with, hand in hand with the subconscious, actually how it's going to contend with the mystery of the unconscious, or the mystery of life itself, or the mystery of the soul, because that's what the unconscious in some sense is. The unconscious is the mode of doing. Let me just, I defined it for someone recently, so let me just read what I wrote. what did I write about? I wrote about the unconscious, about the mode of doing. Come on, where is it? In my model of emotional circuits, I already divided them into three and centered them around the unconscious, which is the objective mode of your false ego's domain of operation. Mode as in the habitual pattern that you do. These modes are functionally true in some sense, but they're not true in any conscious sense. They're true in the habit of performance, in the performative. In some sense, it's a very ephemeral sort of thing, because it's not in the world, it's not in yourself, it's in the performance, it's in the mode of action. And so in some sense it is your karmic vehicle. It is, in some sense, and in some sense, as I've tried to, it's a bit convoluted, but this is also somewhat kind of projected from the superego. The game that is being played is sort of projected from the superego in that it's projecting itself onto, or structurally, procedurally, fundamentally almost, the unconscious is founded in the superego, because that was the original impetus for the development of the subconscious, and thereby also the ego, which then, when the ego and the subconscious develop their independence away from the superego, they tried to understand what it was about their own mode of action, their own functional so they're discovering what their verb is, in some sense. They're delving in terms of looking for the superego in the unconscious, or looking for the substitute of the superego in the unconscious. They are layering on or unfolding a description of their verb, of their mode of being. Delving into their performative self, their unconscious self. So I was actually going to make a recording about describing each side of the mind and trying to sort of define it, and even why I use the words that I use, which is a bit intuitive, and maybe this is a bit sort of post hoc, but essentially the unconscious is unconscious because it's where did I write this? I know I wrote this somewhere. Yeah, let me just find my notes quick. Do I really want to start with the unconscious as well? No. Oh, here we go. Okay, so I've just got unconscious defined as in the mode of doing. And saying doing is slightly ambiguous then, because doing is usually something that I attach to the superego. Anyway, so the unconscious is in the mode of doing. So you're in the process of, it is what you do. The unconscious is what you do. So you're in the mode of doing. The subconscious, so I'm maybe giving this in a bad order. The subconscious is subordinated conscious. It's beneath or below consciousness. It's presuppositional. It's the framework. The superego is the superimposed self-image, because it was the original image, and then it becomes superimposed. Essentially, it is the hidden root, and the subconscious is closer to the surface than the superego, because the subconscious is just beneath, is immediately beneath, and it's presuppositional, and you do have adjacent access to it in some sense, that people can very easily, if you just kind of stress test your subconscious, you can pretty much map it all out and have an ego that is well conscious of the subconscious. Obviously, the superego is more remote to the ego, also because of that obstacle thing about the mutually exclusive resource, or it's not mutually, it's exclusive, it's exclusive to the superego, and it's excluding the ego in terms of the ego sin, so it's not capable of sort of punching through that veil to see the dimensions on continuing after it. Anyway, so unconscious, subconscious. Okay, so yeah, the superego is the superimposed or superimpositioned self-image that is casting a shadow on the ego, and the ego is just the self as conscious mind, which is the ego in the early stages is in the very young child. The ego is not properly formed, essentially because the ego is being animated by both the superego and the subconscious simultaneously, and so the ego is I can't think of the word that means that it's sort of it's fundamentally nebulous. It's got this, I think the word is quixotic sort of depth in it. That subjects are doors to the conflated production of the superego and the subconscious in terms of a myriad permutation, as like a fractal ego unwinding. But some people that are familiar with because I also map these onto the 4Ps that John Vervaeke uses, and people that I know have been looking at that have their own model of psychology or something like that, although I think they're doing some things with it which I don't agree with, but or I just fundamentally disagree with how they're conceptualizing about what these things are, or they're taking a kind of a superficial look at it, but I mean, to suit their purposes, which are already sort of ulterior fundamentally. But so they don't believe in the project of psychology. They believe in something else, like a narrative of something else. But I think that they said that when you're they had two words. Maybe I'm going to mess this up. I don't have my notes in front of me. I think they said that when in translating this into my model, when when the unconscious and the ego oh no, I can't remember, but they had like basically a correlation between two sides of the mind, and they said that yeah, that's what's causing autism, and they had another thing, two things together, and when those things were together, it was causing psychosis. Because I think that they use the subconscious to they also have some descriptive words, and they call the subconscious a navigation signal of knowledge, and they call the unconscious also a navigation signal, I think. Yeah, so I think the subconscious and the unconscious together make autism, but then the ego and the superego together make psychosis. But in some sense, I just described developmentally, I think, what is being caused there. Anyway, yeah, so the ego is the self as conscious mind. Which is, I must say, it's not very descriptive. It's just basically saying that, sort of these are the things that you can do sort of in your prefrontal cortex, something like that. These are the things that you can sort of move around as furniture and control in an immediate sort of sense. It's sort of the thing at the forefront of your conscious direction. What was I saying before that? I was talking about the two other things. So, yeah, I mean, these people had also they have two other things which they don't link to these. They call John Vervaeke's 4Ps. They call them the four knowledge signals, and two of them are navigation, and two of them are two other things. But I can't remember. These are from the John Vervaeke Discord. You can find them there, and one of them is called Mark, one of them is called Manuel, that developed this knowledge model. And then they also talk about two other things, which I haven't seen any slides about other than their name, but they're basically also things that come from John Vervaeke, which is the imaginary, I think, and I don't know, and they have something else which I can't remember. But there are two more things in my model as well, which is basically that the subconscious and the ego are literally in a circuit together, and the unconscious and the superego are also linked together in a circuit, although that circuit is more asymmetrical, because the superego and the ego flow into one another through this circuitry, whereas the unconscious and the superego are a broken circuit. It's a one-way flow, in some sense. So it's very fixed in its character. It's very sort of static and solid and more machine-like in some sense. And the machine-like one I call the id, and the other one, I guess, I haven't thought of a name for it, but I don't know if this is exactly the word that John Vervaeke uses, the imaginary or something like that, but because, well, if you can get a hold of your subconscious and your ego working together well in tandem simultaneously, you can sort of have a kind of self-mastery, a kind of, maybe that's even linked to Keegan stage 4. I think that you could make a good case that that's a pretty good definition for, it's probably a better definition for Keegan stage 4. Although, yeah, I mean, to be able to do that, you would, I think, have had to have graduated from the most toxic elements of getting stuck into Keegan stage 3, or you would have to have some method, and some methods are clunkier than others. Some methods of accessing that kind of integration come with a kind of contract to the unconscious, which then looms over you and holds over your developmental, sort of imprisons your developmental, it confines you to a certain sort of conduit or to a certain rationalization process, and you are just literally plugged in like a don't know how to say it. You're in a conveyance which is in some sense it's chasing a bit of cheese in a maze that can sort of never, that is potentially a kind of inexhaustible program of almost sort of being transfixed into that there's a game or a puzzle that is so mesmerizing that the game cannot be put down, and the layers of the game can sort of be elaborated to keep one's idea that one can extract all the dignity or integrity that one can so wish, that one could ever so wish for, can be sourced within such a game. So if that, and that's essentially because it's that you have developed too early a way to graduate from Keegan stage 3, or from the unconscious side of the mind. The unconscious side of the mind is reduced into a subconscious or an egoic interface, or trying to find a good metaphor. I can't think of any that actually even functionally work. They all actually are just bad metaphors. Like the closest thing I can think of to, because the problem is that this is a bit of cognitive dissonance. It's never going to actually work out. It's because it's kind of like a podium, but it's also like a ladder. So sort of that you've already reached the apex, but the apex is also a ladder to some place, or so it's the apex that you can climb forever. And so the ego has something to do. The subconscious will have a lack of fluidity. The subconscious will be a pedant, will be a kind of enslaved to this. I mean, let me think of a common, ordinary, unconscious kind of thing that would serve or this is not even a metaphor. This is an illustration of a particular form of, let's say, decadent unconscious pegging, or sort of that you've pigeonholed your own unconscious within a particular conception relative to your ego and your subconscious, and that would be something like status seeking. I mean, I guess that might even not be such a bad. I mean, because you could abstract this. I mean, you could probably abstract this out to death denial. You know, the most successful social science, social science theory that has ever been propounded, is terror management theory with its death denial. So, death denial. And so you're doing something like the ego is doing status seeking, and the unconscious is not capable of understanding its own scope, because it's trying to keep itself baked within a mode of being, a mode of doing, which is what it is, that the verb that the ego and the subconscious does all the time, habitually and functionally, is what it's engaged in doing, that it does, that it then does in the immediate moment that it's engaged in, is sort of the maze, the game of life. And the unconscious, in some sense, reducing it to a game is not necessarily a bad construct, because, it allows you to start to delve into the mystery of what the unconscious contains and what it can be unraveled into. But in some sense, that's always up for grabs in terms of what the ego can do with it. But you could recast it in many different kinds of metaphors. But some sense, I guess, so long as you can sort of plumb the depths of it, and you can sort of know because it is unconscious, and so the problem is that it can store much cognitive dissonance, and so in some sense the issue is that can you actually clear it out? And whatever cognitive dissonance is not cleared out is essentially going to be absorbed vicariously or digested vicariously, and in some sense was primed at the start by the superego, was put there it was established by the superego. And therefore the superego is monitoring you via the remote connection of the unconscious, its remote connection, because in some sense it is your original mode of doing, it is your original impetus. So it was your original program, and your original positive child function, in terms of the superego's child function, is the ultimate source of value. But you've distanced yourself from being contiguous with that consciousness, and therefore, and it's also holding you in a kind of mora. It's holding your ego, especially, in a kind of that your ego has no access to the superego child function. And anyway, so I don't even know how to phrase this exactly, because when you're talking about something happening from the other side of it, it doesn't, so this was overcome in alchemical language when they talked about the electric fluid and the magnetic fluid, that essentially that there's a difference between sort of direct impulsion and induction, that the electric current creates an inductive field, and sympathetic I was also this is a disparate idea, but let me just mention it now, that I was also philosophizing recently about the water in my mind, and just refining some of the thoughts that I've been having about it. And the reason why the water of the world is metaphorically, or in scripture is described as the sea of the world, is because death is caused by okay, well, in the spiritual sense, death is the foundation of sin, that you already died, and that is your spirit is languishing in an atrophied state, which is why you're not anyway in terms of the spiritual a bit. Okay, sorry, let me rather say this from the other end. Is that one of the things that you lose when you die is that your salt is now misplaced. It's the ionic nature of your own, let's say, crystalline eminence in the being that you contended that was sinful is scattered about, because in some sense, in many different ways, sin could be argued to be a kind of disorder. That if it was just ordered according to some purpose, some better purpose, or some purpose that actually executed its will, actually accomplished the thing, instead of the non-execution of the will and the relegation of the will into missing the mark. So if you miss the mark, things are disrupted. The salt is scattered, as it were. The salt is lost into the water for somebody else to see the remnant of it, or the residue of it accumulates in the water. And this is what makes the water a witness of the Trinity, essentially, but also that there are all these confused things and confusing things happening. And how do you ground yourself in this? And you have to sort of separate, you have to separate your water from the water of the world. And many people can't do that. They just go along with somebody else's dead purpose. They are inheriting the purposes of the world. And in some sense, it's a noble thing to do, to want to sort of bring to resolution something, but maybe that sin was some sin that is not going to be accorded. It's not going to be, in some sense, what it means to take the sin of the world onto yourself is not that the sin is paid for by your blood. It's not it still has to be true to your blood, which is why you actually have to pay for it. You can sort of make it better, but I would argue that not all. It can't all be made better, because everything out there is not going to be capable of being the best you can do maybe is sort of say, you see, someone tried to do this, and we can all learn from that it was fundamentally self-inconsistent. It was fundamentally self-defeating. But you can't sort of, and in that way you can try to sort of reclaim it as being dignified, or in some sense, but you're not going to be able to rescue the chaff, as it were. Anyway, so what is my point in saying all of this? It's just to basically say that when Jesus was baptized by the water by John, at that moment he was going to be crucified. I mean, because Jesus did not baptize people. Uh, he did not only baptize people with the Holy Ghost and with fire, but because he was baptized by water. And trying to do both simultaneously means that you can't be at peace with the world, even though he offers peace, and therefore he is silent before his accusers, and so he offers the world peace, and he will get his peace. But he'll do so at his own cost. And that is the technology and the model of the crucifixion. And we are not called to admire Jesus, we are called to do the same. There is no vicarious redemption. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And that way must be your way. Pick up your cross and follow him. But yeah, I mean, how people don't want to have an understanding, they just want to be a part of a story or a narrative, anyway. I mean, I guess a lot of that is just sort of, I had another thought about Mark and Manuel, that I think that, I remember that they kept on complaining to me, and they were using something that John Vervaeke, I think, has mentioned, and made me think that I should try to inquire against John Vervaeke all of his thoughts about this topic, because it seems that at least these people, who I guess disagree with John Vervaeke, so perhaps I shouldn't be blaming it on John Vervaeke, but all this thinking around combinatorial explosion, because I don't know, I mean, I'm so speculating, I don't know how John deals with this issue, but when you are in a realm which I guess leads to or precipitating a combinatorial explosion, yeah, maybe you do have to manage it. Maybe how you manage that has to be a kind of dynamic philosophical engine that you have to actually constantly put work and energy into. But just creating a heuristic to try to curb that problem, as it were, is going to be fundamentally a heuristic which, well, anyway, I thought that that's what I thought that these people were a bit hopped up on, or a bit sort of high on, that I mean, I sort of come to this conclusion through thinking back on the themes of this exchange, which, to my mind, involved a lot of sort of you really can project a lot of your worldview into just how you define things, and how you just kind of then just keep on incessantly repeating or explaining almost like a tautological definitional fortress, and then your excuse for bunkering down in this fortress is that, well, this is how we survive the combinatorial explosion of the world that otherwise can't be surmounted except if we are joined in this fortress, and therefore you must sort of, resistance is futile, and this must be the sympathy that everyone grafts in and tethers themselves to, or something like that. And so these are the words, these are the definitions. I mean, I think it's seems like the whole project is a fundamental Trojan horse that's based on a kind of semantic game playing, but essentially maybe I'm just a paranoid person speculating about, sort of, but yeah, I mean, I feel something is very, very rotten. Something is very, very dark. Anyway, I shouldn't have switched topic, but anyway, I guess now I'm just debriefing, going through a thought catalogue. What was the last thing? Oh, I mean, what was the thing I was talking about just before? I was talking about the sides of the mind. I was talking about the sides of the mind. Yeah, it was all just talking about how, because if you can open up the superego's foundation to not just being exclusive to the superego, but being shared by the inferior function of the ego, and the inferior function of the ego is properly integrated with everything else, then you've got a full integration, you've got full self-actualization. So I think that's a good summary to sort of put it like that. And I think that the child function itself, superego's child function, oh sorry, did I just say the superego's I meant to say the foundation, the death of the superego, or the foundation of the superego, and the sin of the superego has to, essentially the ego has to stop sinning. Yeah, that would be it. And it would do that essentially by peaking all of its, peak as in P-I-Q-U-E-I-N-G, or without the E, peaking all of its awareness into the inferior function in the ego, and then simultaneously between the inferior function of the ego and the death of the foundation of the superego, creating a prospective, proactive activity which then gains access. So the inferior function is being included in the superego, and in some sense then the whole superego is the self-actualization, which is in some sense the new personality. So it becomes the sort of the basement. The inferior function becomes becomes the inherited sort of when I say basement, I mean to say sort of the foundation. It becomes the inherited foundation of the superego. Yes, I think that's fine, and that's great. That all works out. And the child function of the superego then is or it's not reframed, but through the behaviorism of having an actual living core now, because now the foundation of the superego will no longer be in a kind of atrophy, because the atrophy is caused by the if I can describe it like that, the schizophrenia of the child function, because the schizophrenia of the superego's child function is that the superego is that the ego wants it but can't have it. It's an impossible standard, because it's idealized, it's put in the future, it's put in a kind of in a place in which it's already a standard that is judging you. Therefore it can't be attained, because it's beyond grasp. So I think that the inferior function has to sort of become part of the superego. Okay, so yeah, I think that's real progress there. And I should have used my proper microphone, but anyway, I didn't plan to make this a proper recording. I probably will have to upload this now just to make sure that I have a good record of my stuff in case anything happens to me. Okay, I interrupted my latest research because I was waiting on something that would have made it easier to collect my notes, collect my my loose papers on my desk, just because I'm always using piles of loose papers, and I was going to organize it anyway. And while I was doing that, I thought I was going to get an organizing system, but it didn't transpire. Anyway, the point is that I used this as a holiday break, so I held everything in abeyance, waiting for this organization system, and just sort of try to think about other things, think about the totality of all the models, and about metatype, and about fitting metatype and metagram in anyway. And I think I've come up now with a stable model for self-actualization in terms of metatype. The only thing that is left for me to do essentially, and I think I've come up with some better constructs or some better understanding of how the whole metatype sort of works together. Although that won't fully happen until I unlock Metagram fully. Okay, so which I'm dealing with right now. This is what my research notes are dealing with. These are my latest research notes, and I'm just trying to decipher my own research notes recently. So one of the things that I did was I did a survey of all the different types of metagram circuits, so that because I always, it's embarrassing whenever I bring it up and I talk about it in a recording and I always say something ambiguous. So then I tried to work out how many different types of circuits there are. And just going through my own notes here, it seems that there are, roughly speaking, there are 3 types, but then there are subtypes of those 3. So there's a single entity identity, oh man, that was let me find the one that has the actual mathematical breakdown. Yeah, I actually tried to get some words in this one. Okay, so you get a single. Okay, so in Metagram Circuitry, there are 3 component emotional tones, or sometimes it's not just a single emotional tone. That you get a stimulus emotional tone or pair of emotional tones. You get a primary counteroffer emotional tone, and you get an emergent response or a pair of emergent response emotional tones. And essentially, it all starts with this. Well, usually, conceptually, I like to think of defining a metagram type around their primary counteroffer, the unconscious emotional tone, because that is their style of their activity, of their mode of. I just explained this in the last recording, where I was going into that whole thing. I don't want to repeat it again, but the stimulus then has 3 different types of stimuluses. There's a single entity stimulus, and half of all types are that. There is, oh my word, why did I call it that? There is what I call a corner stimulus, which 6/16, or I should rather just, let me do the multiplication. 18 out of 48, there are 48 metagram circuits in total. So half of all of those are single entity stimuluses, and 18 out of 48 of them are corner stimuluses, and those are also made up of two subsections. The one, and I don't know the difference between these 2, but I know that there's a difference, so I'm not sure which one is which. That essentially, this means that the stimulus has two emotional tones, but these 2 emotional tones are found within the corner. I've called them, somewhat metaphorically, referring to them as according to how they're presented in one of my diagrams, where I use sort of hexagonal blocks to have 4 hexagonal blocks, which are the 4 field circuits, which are all made up of 3 cognitive functions, which then have arrows one to the other. So it's like and then the corner is implying that, because on the way from one to the next, because there's a flow within each field circuit, there's an emotional tone that's closer to the one cognitive function and an emotional tone that's closer to the other, but they're both made up of a composite of those 2 cognitive functions, both emotional tones. And there are 2 subtypes of corner stimuluses. One has 2 and one has 6 and one has 12. Yeah. So the reason why I'm getting the numbers slightly mixed up is because I've got them all here in fractions over 16, because it's complicated. But essentially, because Metagram circuits can also be subdivided into three major categories, and so structurally 16 is a legitimate number to use in order to, but obviously there are 48 circuits. There might actually be more than 48 because I don't know what these corner and what I'm going to call a double conduit, I don't exactly know the behavior of these things, and they might have ambiguities. Like the corner might not even be that it's both. It might be both or either. It might be that a person with that metagram circuit could just develop one emotional tone in the corner, not the whole corner. Or both. Maybe it is always both. Or maybe one of them is both and one of them is either. Or maybe it's sort of, there's another kind of difference between the two. So I'm not sure about that. That the person might have access to using both, but they don't use both. And some metagram circuits might use both, others might only use one or the other. So I'm not exactly sure what the variance sort of is. It might be that one always uses one as a primary, and the other one is always a kind of, they habitually always cognite using the one as the primary role that their subconscious is centered around, but that the other one is always just going along with the ride, is being taken along for the ride of the other one. Okay, but I don't know the detail of that yet. Okay, or it could be that there are almost two personalities, that having a corner stimulus means, because they will be at odds with one another, means that in some sense you have two distinct lenses, subconscious lenses, that you have a kind of bifurcated subconscious anchor in your psyche. And I've actually got written down here that I think that, where did I write that? I don't know, that only has to do with the emergent response. Yeah, no. So there are also different types of emergent responses. And anyway, this is like a Venn diagram. Anyway, the other type of stimulus, and then what I call a double conduit stimulus, which means that the two emotional tones, an eighth of all the types use that, or 2 out of 16, or 6 out of 48. 6 out of 48 of all the metagram circuits have a double entity conduit stimulus. And that just basically means that there are two emotional tones. And again, I'm not entirely sure if it's both or either, or in an alternative fashion. I'm not sure about that detail. Is what the full set of variants might be in it. But that essentially their stimulus is made up of two emotional tones that are found in different field circuits. But those two different emotional tones are actually linked together by their alchemical symmetry or inverse symmetry. Okay. Okay, then there are, in the primary counteroffer, and I think maybe I've been stupid to not line this up, although I think I've got it written down here somewhere. So how these things actually intersect with one another, that the that all. Okay, well, when I talk about the primary counteroffer, everyone in my model only has one primary counteroffer. And that primary counteroffer is always sharing a corner with the emergent response. So that's a fixed rule, as it were, within my interpretation of metagram circuitry. So that was something that I empirically at some point observed, essentially, or intuited or something like that through my methodology. Yeah, this is when I was sort of telepathically mind reading people and lining this up as that's a metaphor, but emulating their psychology and anyway. So my emergent response, not my so 16 out of 16, or all 48 metagram circuits, are creating a constructive corner with their emergent response, with their primary counter offer. But 4 out of the 16 have what I call an additional virtual primary counter offer, because they have 2 emergent responses. So I might as well talk about the emergent responses first before going back to the primary counter offer. Is that then also that there are 2 types of emergent responses. You get 4 out of 16, or 12 out of 48, are double entity conduit emergent responses, and the rest are single entity emergent responses. Just out of interest, I am a type that has a double conduit stimulus, and I also have a double entity conduit emergent response, which means that anyway, so out of the 4 types that have a double conduit as an emergent response, the 4 out of 16, or 12 out of 48, in terms of how that relates to the primary counter offer, then there's 4 out of 16, or 12 out of 48 for the primary counter offer that corresponds to that emergent response. But then you can divide that into 2 subcategories when you correspond it to the stimulus. If you correspond that to the stimulus, then you can get 2 subcategories, because 12 out of 48, or 4 out of 16 of those, half of them will have a stimulus conduit and half of them will have a stimulus corner. And I believe that the ones with the stimulus conduit can potentially be bipolar type 1, and those with a stimulus corner will be bipolar type 2. Which is why, in my view, the type 2 bipolars are, obviously they don't have major manic episodes and they don't have major psychosis. They just have a kind of, I would say that they're generally sort of mercurial people in some sense, because they can have an internal, anyway, I don't want to describe it, I've described it in other videos. I'm just going to be remembering and saying old things. Let me just move on. The thing here that's worth saying is that okay, so the reason why bipolar type 1 is so different to the other, and why it's the one person, so 2 out of 16, which means 1/8 of the population. So just look, not looking at, obviously I don't know psychometry and I don't know the general population, but just on a technical level, if there are 48 metagram types, if they're all equally represented, which they probably aren't, but if they were all equally represented within the general population, this would mean that 1/8 of the population has a personality style that is that has the potential to develop into bipolar type 1. Anyway, and another eighth has a potential for bipolar type 2, which I also think... anyway, let me just explain how bipolar type 1, I think, manifests, because it doesn't manifest in all people who have the proclivity or the potential. It breaks the Metagram circuit, which is interesting because it can give one, in some sense, a kind of supernatural ability to see meta type, perhaps, and get into meta type issues. But it's very poisonous because if you see those meta type issues, you can't resolve them. You have to resolve them through Metagram. You can't try to abscond and sort of... You're not going to get around Metagram. And so most bipolar type 1 people are, I would say, condemned to trying to cheat karma instead of trying to solve it inside of karma, if I can put it. It's quite blunt and quite crude, but that's just the summary of it. The other thing to say is, okay, what the actual mechanism is. So what is happening is that because the emergent response is a conduit, what happens is that if you use the conduit emotional tone, because like I said, there's always a constructive corner from the primary counteroffer. So this can probably happen both ways, although it's probably unlikely that it happens one way, but it's probably, well, eventually maybe it happens, and this is why people can precipitate and spiral into major manic episodes, is that the corner is functioning between the primary counteroffer and the emergent response, and then what is and the corner is basically keeping the id distinct from the imaginary, or I don't have a good word for it, but you could call it something like, I mean, I usually just conflate it with the ego. Usually when I'm talking about the mind, I conflate immediate consciousness with the ego, and I think that that's actually even a fair conflation to make, because, you know, what John Vervaeke is maybe calling the imaginary, or the capacity to sort of think in your prefrontal cortex, or I don't know if he describes it like that. I mean, maybe I'm even wrong. I didn't learn about brain neurology or anything like that, but apart from some, anyway, I mean, I really don't know, and I don't even care to know, but or at least not at this stage, but they call it the imaginary, but I mean, I don't actually like that word, because I have some teaching about how imagination is a problem and that you have to kind of control it. But in some sense, it is the capability of creating imaginary objects and employing them within the mind in such a way that it can be problematic. So it definitely has that capability or capacity. What's my point? Is that in some sense, it's the ego and the subconscious combined into a single circuit, into a single property because you're using these things together, so you can use them together consciously in some sense, and so it's the combination of the stimulus and the emergent response. But the stimulus and the emergent response needs to have a fire break against the id, essentially. And that fire break is the corner between the primary counteroffer and the emergent response. And this is also how the stimulus develops in the first place, is that the stimulus can only get off the ground. The emotional tone that organizes the subconscious is only allowed to start becoming independent once it actually identifies the unconscious mode of what it does, the mode of its doing, of how it's operating in the world or whatever, to displace the superego, and then the superego so the superego is using the primary counteroffer as its foil in some sense. But the independence of the subconscious and the subconscious and the ego in their circuit together, they can only maintain independence if the ego is doing what? Well, I mean, in some sense, I can't give an explanation because that's what the structure is. The explanation, in some sense, is that it's fundamentally opposed to the primary counteroffer, that the identity of the emergent response is in an emotional tone way. It's sharing a corner, which means that they are mutually exclusive. That in terms of metagram circuitry, they are mutually exclusive. So in some sense, the structural need to develop a mutually exclusive organization that allows for the ego to keep the unconscious unconscious, so that it can perform in terms of its own propositional framing of things. And its stimulus then is its motivation. So the stimulus is the motivation of the emergent response. But the primary counteroffer is it's the central thing that you're doing. You're stuck doing it. It's in the pattern of your habitual functioning in the world, in what it is that you're actually doing. But you're not conscious of it. If you were conscious of it, you wouldn't have an emergent response, because you would then know what it was that you were doing already. You would have a kind of static understanding of as you're doing it. You does what you think, but because there's a distinction between what you does and what you think, essentially the ego only can have a mind if there is a matter held, a matter of action that can be questioned. So the emergent response is the corner that is questioning the primary counteroffer, if I can put it like that. It's structurally it's not exactly an antagonist, but it's structurally, in terms of the emotional tone field circuits, you understand this when you understand the mechanics of the field circuits, is that they are at odds. They are they can't be happening at the same time, essentially. Now, I'm slightly I'm talking off the cuff here, so I might have to. I'm loudly speculating into what I'm about to say now. Is that there are probably multiple ways in which bipolar starts developing, bipolar type 1. But essentially, what maybe one of them is that the emergent response, the double conduit emergent response, the non-corner emotional tone starts to be used by the false ego complex in an abusive way or in an improper way. And what improper means in this context is something like it is starting to be used independently of the primary corner. And when you use the conduit emotional tone, you're getting a kickback on the other emergent response emotional tone. There becomes a sympathetic symbiosis, and that sympathy between the two, and that power sharing between the two in the emergent response, is like a perhaps it's also like a marriage or something like that. But there's some kind of internal drama that happens between these two emotional tones. That these two emotional tones have these two separate things, and maybe it's only types. Maybe only types. The only types that can do this, or by definition, I've actually already defined bipolar type 1 like this, is that they have a stimulus conduit emotional tone, so that they already have the propensity that they can have they have a bifurcated subconscious framework, perspectival framework. So their stimulus probably at the same time is playing favorites as to which emergent response. So the stimulus starts ingraining within itself or imprinting within itself. Let's call it what's not called adultery, but sort of philandering, or but there's a kind of, one of the stimulus conduits is connected to the prime corner, and the other one is connected to the non-prime corner in the emergent response. And you end up with almost two independent circuits that are going through the same primary counteroffer. So in some sense, the only thing that keeps this together is that there's a single primary counteroffer. Now, what I think happens is that between these two circuits, when I say circuits, I mean this different to when I was talking about meta-type circuitry between the subconscious and the. When I say two circuits, I mean that this is happening in the metagram circuitry, but also happening through the sides of the mind simultaneously. But when I say circuits, I mean, in some sense, I mean both metagram circuitry and the meta-type unconscious superego and subconscious ego, but more to do with the subconscious ego. So the subconscious ego is essentially starts to delineate into two personalities almost, or two independent structures that become so intelligent or so robust independently, but they are still using the same primary counteroffer. Now, eventually, I think what happens is that there's a kind of war, a civil war between these two structures. Or essentially one is always stronger than the other, or one is always dominant over the other. To begin with, because these things are never even, these things are not developed simultaneously, or there's nothing structural that says that these things have to be at the same strength. When the false ego is started, it probably has a proclivity or a natural tendency towards being in the one, not the other. And in some sense, perhaps this is also something that gets mediated in the development from the oceanic phase into a more anchored ego that is anchored in the subconscious. But in some sense, these individuals are never properly anchored in their subconscious, because their subconscious has a fundamental ambiguity or nebulousness. But that nebulousness is structural nebulousness. In practice, it's always going to be, generally speaking, one is going to be stronger than the other. Now, I think that what happens is that some bipolar individuals work out how to master this ability, having two people, two different things, and they can use it, they can specialize with it, they can sort of play tag team, send in the one or send in the other, that they're both thinking simultaneously through the same primary counteroffer. They're still essentially the same person, they just have two different distinct metagram circuits which can also work together and work independently to some degree, but through the unconscious, through the core of the unconscious. Primary counteroffer is still the centralizing principle of the whole structure. But then what happens, I think, is that if the one ever abuses the other, if the one ever takes the upper hand over the other and uses the other one to delegate work to, and that delegation, I think what it does is that it creates a real Cold War and a real Civil War. And once the Cold War has started, then you are warming up until a major manic episode. And what is happening in the major manic episode is that it's the it's the non-cornered emergent response. It's the conduit emergent response emotional tone which is charging energy because it's being suppressed by the other circuit effectively. And what it's doing is that it is cursing the primary counteroffer with mood, with aberrant salience, because it's not and maybe this happens already. Essentially, this is what this is the curse of, also, maybe it's not even a Cold War in that the one is overtly abusing the other. It's that they don't agree on the same path for the primary counteroffer. Both of these independent intelligences or circuits are having problems sharing the primary counteroffer. The one circuit strategy for interfacing with the primary counteroffer or delving into the unconscious mystery of the participatory realm of life, the unconscious unfolding of defining what it is that I do. So if delving into the unconscious, as I've defined it, the unconscious side of the mind, is delving into describing the verb that you do in the world, and that's also almost a substitute for your superego as well. That's almost, it's another way of, in some sense, being gamed by your superego that you've lost connection with perhaps as well. But and this is the activity which is the substitute to the conscious connection with your superego, or in some sense that you are implicitly allowing the superego to then project its judgment and its child function onto you in this activity of performing what it is that you do and then experiencing it real time. So you are living in your unconscious in real time. It is your fatalism, the confinement of your soul under the weight of the unconscious, which is being essentially caused by the superego more so than anything else. But anyway, so the problem is that there's a disagreement over what it is in terms of the emergent response. And this, I would also say, has to be facilitated by a bifurcated stimulus or subconscious emotional tone, a bifurcated subconscious emotional tone. You are then getting disagreement and discord between the two circuits over how to describe the primary counteroffer, and this is what is causing aberrant salience or thoughts of reference. Is that the one emotional tone is cursing the other, the one, I wanted to say circuit rather, the one circuit which has as its head the one emergent response is cursing the other one. For the ambiguity that is created, for the the ambiguity in integrity from its perspective. From its perspective, it has a contestation over what the integrity of the unconscious, what is the status of the unconscious relative to this emergent response. Now, the non-cornered emergent response has a much freer hand to describe the unconsciousness because it is not cornered. in conjunction with the unconscious. So it has a more poetic, it has a more artistic latitude, and it can have a broader idea about what it is to do. But the cornered emotional response is limited by the fact that it has to play the dupe, because it can't. It's the other side of the coin. It's on the other side of the corner. The primary counteroffer is in Metagram cognitive function terms, emotional tone terms. It's the other side of the coin. It's oppositely charged. So the nebulousness being created by the conduited emergent response rather than the cornered emergent response is that the conduited emergent response is creating an ambiguity of reference. It's creating a nebulousness of significance. And within that nebulousness, the cornered emergent response and also primary counteroffer is having to burden an explosion of interpretation. It's kind of like an untapped resource. Of virgin significance to sort of be postulated ad hoc or in the immediate. Now, I think that what is in fact happening now, that I'm referencing this according to the actual central figure of someone's circuitry. The central figure of someone's circuitry is their primary counteroffer, is their unconscious, what it is that they do. Because if you lose what you do, you're a different person. You're doing something else. You know, the continuity, the contiguous sequential stream of what it is that you do is what gives you even memory and access to anything. Now, what this ambiguity actually is that the conduited emergent response is conjuring an alternative primary counteroffer. It's conjuring, it's summoning what its cornered primary counteroffer would be. But when it does that, it has no stimulus. So what is in fact happening but this is an abstract metaphor. This is not, what I'm about to say is not true, but it is half true, and in some sense it's metaphorically true. It's in some sense it's archetypally true. It's not properly true, but this is what makes it madness. This is why it's madness, is because what is happening is not possible. It's self-inconsistent. It's fundamentally unsound. What's happening is that there is an alternative primary counteroffer that has as its correlate no stimulus. So there is opening the door to a different personality, to an alternative personality style that never had a stimulus. It has no stimulus. And if you have no stimulus, then you're kind of also back in an oceanic sort of sense. You have an ego. In fact, you might even have an overly active ego, because your ego has a footprint inheriting a mature primary counteroffer, which is also in some sense being displaced by an alternative primary counteroffer. But essentially so you are untethering the formerly cornered emergent response. You are atomizing it and tethering it perhaps to this new primary counteroffer. So you're reconstellating around the conduited emergent response, and the old cornered emergent response is becoming the conduited emergent response, and the roles are switching between the emergent response, because you're essentially getting a virtual primary counteroffer. But that virtual primary counteroffer is fundamentally untenable because it doesn't have a stimulus. So it only happens because the emergent response, the conduited emergent response, is playing a long game of charging itself. It's like a powder keg. It's storing potential energy until it has enough to explode and storm the gates and create a virtual primary counteroffer, but it only has egoic energy to run on, and eventually it runs out. And when it runs out, you are back to zero. And maybe how long you were in that state, the damage that is done is the damage that is done to the atomized, or the original cornered emergent response, because the original cornered emotional tone has to become, the emergent response that has the original cornered emergent response, that emotional tone has to become now the cornered one again. Which might even be good, because this could on a structural level, this could be seen as a palate cleanser. Because on some level you can say, well, look, the problem is that this problem doesn't have to exist, which is why solving this problem is relevant to some degree. But to the point at which that you are already accumulating unstable energy within the conduited emergent response, that has to be dissipated somehow. And at least if you go through the cataclysm of reversing the roles and atomizing and turning the formerly cornered emergent response into a conduited emergent response, you're getting even, or the two conflicting circuits are getting even. They're getting an opportunity to wear the other pair of shoes or something like that. So the one could be seen in some constructive sense as teaching the other one to know a more reason, because even though you have this conduited emergent response, doesn't mean that you should use it as a sponge, as a holding bay. Doesn't mean that you should use that emotional tone without integrity, that you should use it as a resource, as a special power, because then you can outmaneuver things or something like that. So, well, in some sense, the real problem is that you have to learn how to use your emotional tones, which in some sense also means that you have to integrate and self-actualize in any case. But this is a structural abnormality, this is a psychopathology which is only experienced by, well, I've hypothesized maybe 1/8 of the population. Now that's the very special case of bipolar type 1. And by the way, let me just make this other small comment, although this is not, I think, in social psychology or as a kind of cultural commentary, let me just state that I think that maybe the whole of society goes through these cycles in a collective sense, that in some sense the entire, this might be the, I've always thought that essentially that what is plaguing us is borderline personality disorder, but maybe it's actually in some great sense we are collectively going through cycles of bipolar type 1, of integration, of a living experience that, and I mean this probably, I'm not reinventing the wheel. I mean, Hegel probably was describing exactly what I've just said, but in psychological mechanism. sorry, I'm saying it in psychological mechanism, and Hegel just sort of did it in more abstract and thematic sort of archetypal thingies, ways of describing it. What else should I say? Is that, should I talk about bipolar type 2? I haven't thought about it. Well, the only thing that's different in bipolar type 2 is that the stimulus is a cornered stimulus. It's not a... So in some sense, this is why I think bipolar type 2 people, even before they develop overt bipolar symptoms, I think are usually quite difficult people. And I actually have a feeling that a lot of narcissists, like psychopathic, I think that bipolar type 2 people are the people who are perhaps traumatized as young children, and then they become narcissists. Anyway, that just occurred to me to say. That essentially, maybe it also, bipolar type 2 probably presents itself as a particularly problematic developmental obstacle because it makes the stimulus between the emotional tones and the stimulus itself. The subconscious itself is capable of consuming itself, is capable of sort of fighting, is having this mercurial agitation in itself fundamentally. And so, and you must remember that this is I mean, what I'm saying is might be broad because bipolar is caused not just by having a cornered stimulus. In some sense, 3/8 of the population has a cornered stimulus. So that probably means 3/8 of the population might be prone to narcissism. It might not be. Bipolar type 2 is two. No, it's one. Wait, how do I? Yeah, okay, sorry. So cornered stimuluses might. What I was saying was probably not specific to bipolar type 2 narcissism, if that's speculation or if that interests you, whatever. Narcissism probably corresponds to all cornered stimuluses. But bipolar type 2 just makes up 1/3 of. Sorry, I'm trying to talk about math. It's hard to verbalize. 3/8 of all metagram circuits have cornered stimuluses. I think that the narcissism thing that I said probably applies to all of those 3/8, and bipolar type 1 is 1/8 of all metagram circuits. Sorry, bipolar type 2 I meant to say. But both is also true. Bipolar type 1 and bipolar type 2 is also what, from a categorical perspective of circuitry, it's that fraction. Anyway, 3/8. There we go, 3/8. So out of 3/8 of cornered stimuluses, I would say bipolar type 2 is 1/3 of that, or 1/8 of everyone. Anyway, what's my point? Okay, so having a cornered stimulus. Oh, that might be the difference between, because I said before that they were, so maybe the 2 out of 16 are the bipolar people. Let me double check that. I think that's actually correct. And I didn't make a key for the symbol that I used, so I'm not sure. No, it is. Yeah, no. Oh, there. Yeah, no. That's where the asterisk is. Yes. Okay, so the 2 out of, yeah. So there is a distinction between the 4 out of 16 and the 2 out of 16. anyway, of the cornered stimuluses. Anyway, so let me just see. So so actually this becomes an easy way to talk about it then, is that there are 4 types of circuits. There are only 4 types of, okay, finally I have an answer to the basic question. There are 4 types of circuits only. Okay. And I always doubted myself whenever I said that there are sort of the roughly speaking, the single circuits and double circuits, and then there are different types of double circuits. Anyway, okay. Yeah, there are 3 types of double circuits, and there's 1 type of single circuit. Yeah, it's simple. That's good to finally have just a numerical answer of these things. Okay, anyway, okay, so let me try to describe bipolar type 2. Sorry, so, I mean, that's quite profound, because that means that essentially you should only be, that means that you should be able to classify all psychopathologies into 4 categories using this as a sort of as a matrix, or as a sort of as a structural category system. Anyway, what else should I say? What else should I say? I must say, this does I wonder if some of the people that I'm dealing with at the moment are sort of, I mean, I guess you would call this a kind of Keegan stage 2, if the stimulus is projecting things onto the unconscious side of the mind, which is also what I feel like bipolar type 2 people and narcissists are both doing, that their subconscious is sort of eating itself, and they are projecting onto the unconscious side of the mind, and their ego becomes kind of, sometimes you can have a kind of fickle, or maybe I shouldn't say that, but you end up with a brittle, egoic valence or mask. You end up with an ego which is kind of the aftermath of, in some sense, the multiplication of the stimulus within its own kind of problem, then sort of reduced or and then you subtract the unconscious's kind of gerrymandered, projection that's happening on it, and then sort of the ego becomes this kind of cognitive dissonance, but or in the form of a kind of perpetual conflagration that has no resolution, but that you are looking for a scapegoat within the unconscious to sort of to join, that you can compel people with an argument in the unconscious realm to sort of, to either that you label them, you label them as this permanent property within the unconscious, and I think that these people that I'm dealing with, I think, are sort of Keegan stage 3.5, as that kind of nihilism where you're stuck in building a sort of Tower of Babel out of some kind of semantic definitional solidity, but it's really just a kind of juvenile game of being able to sort of provide dignity to your subconscious. your subconscious is needing to be propped up, and you have all these sort of sympathetic mechanisms with your other side of the mind, but essentially what's taking the brunt of it is the ego. But in some cases, the ego can get a coherence. The ego can extract coherence. If you create enough of a sophisticated unconscious mechanism, and if you create a sophisticated enough unconscious projection that is in some sense propounding, sort of able to spiral into itself, but seemingly conserve itself the next round, because it's able to continually reproduce and reiterate itself, then you can use that as a cover to say that your ego, it just becomes very brittle. It just becomes a kind of a pedant, a kind of, it becomes static. It becomes a kind of some sense, you can't really blame people for having static egos, but maybe the problem is that it's not static, is that it's it's retreating, but it doesn't see itself as retreating, or it's stuck in a performative contradiction that it can't detect, or that it can't, because it's got an unconscious heuristic that helps it sort of truncate that observation. But what I was going to say is that, in some sense, the final solution to the false ego complex is bringing the ego into a kind of static integration so that it can reconcile with the superego, and then the superego becomes livened, becomes alive, it becomes enlivened from the ego. But the thing that is enlivening it from the ego, in some sense, does become something like a kind of static residual repository of everything in the rest of the false ego complex, because it is the integration of everything properly. But the ego, in some sense, is just a kind of, is a crystal ball. It's just it has no, it's just meant to be an error checking, troubleshooting, sort of clearinghouse of potential. I don't know, I think it is almost meant to end up being somewhat reflexive, but I guess you can use it for creation, for creativity. I'm just trying to think. But you have to do it with the inferior function. You have to make the inferior function the hero function. I need to think about that. That's perhaps going a bit, I'm talking too fast and loose. I need to ponder this a bit. So what is the relationship between the dominant function of the ego and the inferior function of the ego? Just need to think about it within myself. So my inferior function is dimension 2, introverted feeling, and my dominant function is 17, extroverted sensing. But not the people will think that sounds strange, because I tell people that I'm an INTJ, which I am an MBTI, but they're two different extroverted sensings. There's dimension 8 extroverted sensing and dimension 17 extroverted sensing, and dimension 17 is very esoteric, if I can put it like that. And it's basically also stifled by my ego's parent function, which is extroverted feeling. But in some sense, what it's more stifled by is by my ego's child function, which is another extroverted feeling, which is a very esoteric version of extroverted feeling, which is what makes everything slow down for the INTJ in some sense, or in terms of not being able to find the words. Well, yeah, I mean, you can't really say slow down. I mean, ITJs are probably one of the quickest, cerebrally speaking, one of the fastest, if not perhaps the fastest. I can't. I mean, or there's certainly. I guess there are other types of cerebral quickness. I mean, there are things that. I mean, whenever I'm collaborating with other people, usually doing some really amazing things because somebody else knows a lot about problems in the world, and I can get them to order their knowledge in such a way that the problem can actually be solved. And I've done that with academics, with people in many fields. But I always get them to repeat things, like remember a man, I can't even remember his name. Well, he really fell out of the limelight. He was maybe going to get into politics, I think. He's still a famous economist. I think I helped him come up with a I can't even remember what they called it, but just a general. I think that he was basically made famous because he made sense of the 2000. He was one of the people who actually sort of. It's amazing how things happen in history, but no one knows how to understand it or what to call it, or you almost have to wait 10 years before someone can actually sort of put a name to what's gone on. But yeah, I mean, this is why I know I have such a general knowledge of so many things, because I've helped other people solve problems in many different fields, and so like I have some mechanical understanding of some things, but not in a way that I can ever talk about it, because it's such a bastardized, specialized subset of the thing, and I navigated it with questions to someone who did actually know all the things. That's the kind of creativity I think that you have with the ego, generally speaking, and then obviously people will have different gifts according to what their egoic set is. And in some sense, I think that the inferior function is the freest function. I must maybe think about that some more. I mean, it's free because it's unattached originally to the corruption in the ego. So it's like the prime seed of sanity, and it's usually being internally overlooked by people. So actually maybe that's also, I mean, many people are offended by their inferior function because it obscures their child function, and that in some sense is a mark that they're not properly integrated, or that they're not working towards or maybe they are, but they're just not mature yet, is another way of putting it. They haven't found a way to make peace with these disparate, this set of contentiousness that's happening within the ego. Anyway, I've actually made some very good theoretical progress just talking through all of this. So yay for me, and it's very sad for everyone who has to listen to this stuff, but anyway, hopefully I'll turn this into a book and no one will have to suffer through this, but anyway, this is my time capsule in the meantime, in case I don't get to actually properly finished, but it's getting along nicely. Hopefully it's going to be finished soon. Okay, I've been meaning to make an addendum to the last topics I was talking about for a while now. I just wanted to clean up something. So I speculated, perhaps too self-consciously, that that the bipolar type 2 types were perhaps not the ones that developed narcissism, as in like narcissism personality disorder, and I enlarged it to perhaps anyone who has a corner type stimulus. Yeah, I mean, that may or may not be true. I actually think that let's say the bipolar types, and specifically the bipolar type 2, I think I believe that it would be good to do an investigation into those types, because I feel that it is more likely that those are the types that are the ones that produce narcissism, coupled with a very kind of traumatic early development. And I came to this conclusion because I was surveying my own psychological case, let's just say, which involves perhaps a very complicated form of dissociative identity disorder. So my own symptoms of dissociative identity disorder, I don't think I have any kind of classical presentation, although I do think I have some classical symptoms, and I was trying to get a deeper diagnosis in terms of the model, in terms of how this psychological construct is usually thought about. And I think essentially what's happening is that the person with a dissociative identity disorder is stuck in a coping mechanism that fuses the disjointed ambiguity which the two independent circuits have to find some mediating consensus around. So in some sense, a personality forms that has, to the ordinary viewer, a kind of quixotic exuberance and eccentricity, because essentially the person has to work out a way to deal with mundane, ordinary things in life, but also a kind of extreme trauma, and has to find a way to do these things simultaneously, because they exist, or they coexist, or at least there is I don't know how to put this more neatly, but there's a practical impetus to, like, let me rather just illustrate the point rather. So you can imagine a small child sitting in their bedroom all alone, and the door is closed, playing with some toys or playing with some blocks or something, and hearing shouting in other rooms, and the constant this ongoing environmental condition is signaling a kind of fundamental existential threat and danger and safety issue. But in some sense, the child can't just lie catatonic, staring up at the ceiling and trying to sort of wish away life. The child also has some toy in front of him or her to play with. So there is this idea that one can escape by pretending that one is not experiencing the untoward condition in the environment. And so one has the ability to do both because one has two circuits, two independent circuits. So you can try find a way to do both simultaneously, and then you just have the peculiar case of trying to fuse them into a single persona that has a spectrum, a single metric in terms of, well, how you dial this up. And so this requires an intellectual eccentricity of trying to find a way to modulate both of these activities of being vigilant to the existential environmental dangerous condition, and how to maximize one's opportunity to leading a good life that is otherwise capable of being enjoyed in some sense, even though there is this ulterior sort of constant rain on one's parade. So in the hailstorm, one is trying to have a nice trip or a nice outing to the beach or a nice picnic. One is trying to ordinarily go about one's normal life, but being pelted by the metaphorical hail of having to contend with looking over one's shoulder constantly in some sense. And so the fusion of both of these things simultaneously is obviously slightly seemingly schizophrenic, to use that word very, very loosely, as but essentially it's to find a way in which both can be authentic. And so you need a device, you need a mechanism that allows you to constantly be stressed and managing that stress so that one is capable of responding appropriately to threats to one's physical survival, perhaps, that one is in the presence of a dangerous source of escalating psychopathy, in terms of that the environmental condition is capable of transpiring into a very grievous drama that one has to suddenly be able to participate in so as to mitigate loss. So one is constantly ready to be conscripted into a kind of survival mode, while at the same time trying to maximize, let's say, ordinary concerns. And so this juxtaposition has to be driven or controlled or managed from something that's capable of doing both extremes. And in some sense it's a way, it's because in some sense it's not, they are both extremes relative to each other, but they're not two extremes. The one is ordinary and the other one is extremely negative, but relatively speaking they are both extremes. And in some sense perhaps the capacity to properly respond to the negative scenario and the capacity to engage and participate in the mellow and ordinary course of life simultaneously has to be conflated into
a single frame of reference. Now, in some sense, that's not really possible, or it is possible, but at the sacrifice of some concepts, some basic concepts, perhaps like trust. So, trust is always therefore a relative thing, but and in some sense, I think that that might also be a perennial truism as well. One can have trust, but one's trust can never be vetted or validated conclusively. But essentially, some combinatorial procedure has to be able to account for both extremes, has to be good for both cases, has to be capable of being readily deployable in both sectors. Now, this consistency of style comes at the cost of an inconsistency of reference and memory, because it's impossible to have an ordinary, mellow context of participation when one is simultaneously making quick and fast discernments as to, let's say, necessary actions so as to help to promote the lesser of two evils or something like that. You know, that sort of at the drop of a pin, one has to be able to manage an answer to Sophie's choice, essentially. So a personality style is capable of doing this, but only so much as they are capable of immediately reading the current temperature of the current immediate context. So one's psychological valence becomes channeled not by one's internal, let's say, propitiative decision of directed impetus or planning. It becomes contingent on environmental markers. And this is essentially what promotes the symptoms of dissociative identity disorder, is that the context unlocks the reference, because the memory itself and the reference structure itself is occluded by, and this is essentially is the necessary filter so that one can fulfill both roles, which are essentially at odds with one another. That it's like an embodied cognitive dissonance, being able to respond to an emergency while simultaneously being capable of absorbing in a concerted way patience and, in some sense, in both cases, there is a stringent, deliberate extension of attention over the immediate present, but this incredible acuity and attention to detail essentially comes at the cost of one's conveyance of personal reference, or sorry, one's natural carriage, one's internal carriage of scope in relation to one's own purposes. But this is, I'm speaking slightly bit too broad and abstract, because what I'm saying is slightly incorrect, in that the memory, what I'm saying is correct in reference to the memory, but the memory is not actually the prime mechanism here. The prime mechanism is the coping strategy, or the actual spectrum which the persona is grounded in, which is in some sense a kind of coping mechanism, for an example, on trust. So, because in some sense, so you can do this by, again, this is slightly abstract, but this is closer to the truth, in terms of what actually is causing the mechanism, is that the personality does not have a way to directly contend with trust in a conscious way. Trust is conditioned. And I wish I had my diagram in front of me. Because I just wanted to give a comment around my own personality type, just to layer it onto what I'm saying about dissociative identity disorder. But essentially, this is just one metatype example of if it's true that the bipolar type 1 is the one that precipitates dissociative identity disorder. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's the parent function of the subconscious. And 11 is the inferior function of the subconscious, which is the foundation of the unconscious. Anyway, and the parent of the subconscious anyway is priming the inferior function of the unconscious. So it's stuck in that conveyance. Anyway, what I was just going to say is that some capacity is going to be locked away. So some capacity is going to be stuck out of bounds and set in a kind of functional mechanism. And while that functional mechanism is facilitating the image of the identity of one or between the sides of the mind, solidifying being part of solidifying the operating condition of the identity, or at least the image of the identity, furnishing it an image of an identity from which that it can be articulated. So sort of it has intrinsically within that image locked this issue, for example, of trust. What's the point? Is that what I was going to say? Is that so something is locked away. I mean, this is what I'm saying now. It can also be generalized to all metatypes. That when a parent function is being a parent function and is operating in at least my theoretical model, shows how it interrelates with other sides of the mind's inferior function, priming other sides of the mind's inferior function, or projecting images onto them, or identities, creating an identity of a preceding side of the mind, or taking adoption of its own local side of the mind's foundation, which is being donated to it by the prior side of the mind's inferior function, because the prior side of the mind's inferior function is the local side of the mind's foundation, or otherwise I call it the conditioning or the death, because that identity is essentially dead. It is just a dead image that then functions mechanically based on that. So in some sense, I'm talking about the mechanics of how metatype hides its circuitry within a conceptual subject matter, for instance, trust. So essentially the identity of a particular emotional tone, the identity of one side of the mind or another that then takes on the image of a particular emotional tone is going to have an activity. It's not just going to be a dead mechanism image, it's going to be an image that is operating in some space that is made for it by, for example, a parent function. So the parent function is making space for these inferior functions, and this is also why you have a disintegrated you have a lack of an integration between the sides of the mind, is because the parent functions and the inferior functions are helping warden off and cordon off their respective sides of the mind. And in some sense, each local parent function is itself a kind of handmaiden. No, sorry, I don't want to say handmaiden. I want to call it like a regent, like the regent of a ruler, sort of taking the authority of the dominant function and the child function, but actually playing a bit of a game and going beyond the exact remit that is permitted to it, because it's playing both sides, it's playing in both courts, it's playing in two sides of the mind, it has an eye on these things, and in some sense that's sort of its role as a kind of regent. But anyway, so obviously the subconscious parent function, I mean, the subconscious itself is going to have a lot of primordial hurt in terms of, the subconscious is, the growth of the subconscious is the growth of the false ego complex. Everything in some sense is anchored in the subconscious, although obviously if the ego is a bad audience and critic of the subconscious, then obviously the ego can also cause certain malformations and psychopathologies or whatever. But and in some sense it is the using the metaphor that the ego is a critic and an audience of the subconscious. In some sense, based on its criticism, it will promote the next movie. It will guide the production of the next movie or something like that. It will guide the narrative and the plot of the next movie based on the judgment that is provided to the subconscious from the ego. Yeah, so the subconscious can't be seen in isolation of the ego. It is fundamentally sort of connected to that. But anyway, sorry, I'm going all over the place here. So in the case of dissociative identity disorder, I'm going to guess that the issues that need to, and people already do this when they heal dissociative identity disorder, they do so by finding all the disjointed strategies, and they essentially play a kind of this might be a bit of a rough description of the therapy of dissociative identity disorder, but essentially they play a kind of I don't know how to put this nicely. but you essentially, you come to a conclusion over the ambiguity of strategy, of coping mechanism. In some sense, you bring your coping mechanism up into real time, into the present. You update your coping mechanism and you survey it so that it stops becoming a coping mechanism and it starts becoming essentially just your bona fide psychological schema. Obviously, this is not entirely possible in many circumstances, because when the coping mechanism is literally being used, I don't think it's possible, essentially, to make it not a coping mechanism in some sense. And in some sense, the ambiguity that is caused is because essentially there's an issue to do with a concept which is not being properly processed, is not being properly captured and monitored or evaluated in good faith. And because essentially this topic has to be measured in a kind of bad faith so as to perpetuate the coping mechanism, this is a self-referencing or tautological sort of catch-22 or double bind. Another way of saying it is that there is a bona fide ambiguity in terms of like that there is actually a quandary, there is actually an indecision on a conceptual matter, on a conceptual basis, on a kind of metaphysical or existential, almost philosophical or moral point. There is essentially a fundamental indecision that you can't commit oneself to the one without monitoring the other, and the other is also disruptive. So there's an inherent incongruity, and that incongruity is just a kind of ongoing practical source of disturbance. And so one is practically coping with that disturbance in an almost, not even in terms of the integrity, in terms of metaphysical integrity, but in terms of practical survival, I guess. So it's a kind of, it's a heuristic which is convenient in facilitating some kind of compromise, which is something like a negotiated or even a developed or an evolved strategy of optimizing between extremes, essentially. And so, people with dissociative identity disorder, I would argue, are actually incredibly proficient at multitasking, although some can also be prone to self-sabotage or other forms of, obviously I'm speaking much too broadly, because I'm also thinking about my own peculiar case. There are probably, usually people with dissociative identity disorder are very psychologically damaged people. They are very fraught and incapable of contending a kind of coherent edifice. They're very unstable people often, but I would argue that that is because they have augmented the scaffolding of a dissociative identity disorder with other addictive, almost like coping, ritualistic. They're not using, let's say, I've got perhaps the most circumspect version of the disorder. And in some sense, I would argue that perhaps, although my disorder involves the concept of trust, that is the thing that is perhaps also anchoring my false ego complex and my metagram circuitry, at least in the subconscious framing. It's interesting how essentially I think that the escape, you can still have a virtual escape from metagram circuitry to some degree in the unconscious. Or should I say through the unconscious? Okay, sorry, this is a different topic, so let me just talk about the unconscious because I wanted to elaborate on this topic independently of that segue. I think that the reason why the unconscious is I was talking about the unconscious. What was I saying? The reason why the unconscious. So, I mean, the unconscious, in some sense, is the closest way we have to tap into the superego, which is in some sense the origin of our whole false ego complex, and is in some sense the game master of the false ego complex. And the development of the unconscious identity is the thing that the whole false ego complex revolves around. It is the major axle that everything else is turning around in terms of the subconscious and the ego. And to some extent also the superego, although it is a direct representation of the superego as well. And that's why the superego is so shrouded in the shadow of the unconscious. Okay, sorry, I'm jumping around slightly. So I wanted to say that also I think that the problem with the superego's child function, which is the first positive valuation that is found within the superego, the problem with it in terms of the entire structure of the false ego complex is that it is outside of time. It already happened, and maybe it will happen. It's sort of, it's an ideal which one cannot inhabit or channel. And it is that ideal which is holding the sin of the ego against the ego, and it is creating the mystery or the ambience of the unconscious identity. So this is the mystery surrounding the woman and the dragon in Revelations, I think. Babylon the Great, mother of harlots and abominations in the earth. what is it? Mystery. That was also one of the names. Written on the forehead of the woman is just Babylon the Great, mystery, or was it mystery first? Mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of harlots and abominations in the earth. And so I think that is perhaps a description of the child function in the superego. And I keep on thinking that the dragon has something to do with perhaps the dominant function of the unconscious, which is also what each metatype is named after the dominant function of the subconscious. I meant to say unconscious, not subconscious. Each metatype is named after the dominant function of the unconscious. And so I do think that is the dragon, the red dragon, perhaps even. So I wonder if that isn't sort of the general sort of key to therapy as well, is that you need to, or at least in terms of how you're integrating with the ego's inferior function, it needs to be cognizant that it has to essentially ground the superego so that the child function can actually be performed in real time. It can actually be done so that it is not held in this mysterious, timeless state, that it is placed in time, it is used within the identity of the emotional tones of each side of the mind, is set into fluidity instead of having to be confined in these grooves of what is a kind of the enactment of the idolatry of the whore and the beast, or the dragon and the woman. And when the dragon flies away with the woman to have a child, that is in some sense discovering the mechanism through which the unconscious side of the mind precipitates a new inferior identity, the identity of its inferior function, which will renew the ego. But that mechanism is essentially the penultimate mechanism that one has to discover about the false ego complex before one can actually drive that mechanism into full integration with the inferior function of the ego. If one just uses that mechanism but still has it disjointed, the two towers of essentially the inferior function of the ego and the inferior function of the unconscious, that needs to be bridged in a proper integration for the inferior function of the ego to actually form a proper new personality with the superego, which is what I think is a much more detailed description of Keegan Stage 5, essentially. I think what Keegan often describes as Keegan Stage 5 is people who are doing the metafluidity are essentially just deriving the precipitation of a renewed inferior function in the unconscious. And they do that out of convenience. They do that out of necessity, perhaps. They do that to blend into the game that other people are playing in their environment. And in some sense, this is also why some people can go through major personality development often as well, is that they run this mechanism in some ritualistic fashion just to remodel, in some sense, to create a new game piece, a new avatar of, in terms of their superego, is going to create a new representation of the unconsciousness. The child function in the superego is going to have a powwow with the dragon of the unconscious. and precipitate a new baby, a new child, which is the formation of the ego, or essentially a new container for the ego to operate propositionally therefrom. So what's the point of saying this? Is that the problem with this mechanism is that it is essentially a diversion, I think. It's not uncovering this mechanism is in some sense uncovering one of the major mechanisms that it is to relive the formation of the false ego complex, and therefore to unveil or to remind oneself of the activity that founded or structured the false ego complex to begin with. So it brings one into a similar moment in terms of one's cognitive construction of this whole edifice. And being able to see the unconscious and the superego connected like this by focusing in on the child function, one also has an opportunity to pluck the child function from its timeless tense and to place it in a form in which that it is integrated in the unconscious inferior function in a way that it can be transmitted to the ego's inferior function, so that the ego can inherit responsibility for and from, through the daisy chain or whatever, down through parcel, but for and from originally the child function of the ego, and when the child function of the superego. So essentially, when the inferior function of the ego inherits essentially through the proper channel connection, direct connection with the child function of the superego, in that moment you have an ability to act as a holistic, self-actualized, in the blink of an eye, in the twinkling of an eye. You are plucking the child function of the superego out of its timeless stasis and into actionable parameters of direct articulation, essentially. And you're not dealing with it as a disembodied judge against the soul of your ego, in some sense. Or really, I mean, the soul in some sense is better described as being the unconscious more than anything else, since that's the participatory realm. But essentially, you have to do this via the dragon, though, via the dominant function of the unconscious, and probably the parent function as well. But the dominant function is the first obstacle, as it were. And in some sense, if you can get the dominant function of the unconscious on your side, then the parent function of the unconscious will have to generally follow suit, I would say. Or it will be like a domino effect from the dominant function. So you have to send the dragon off with the woman to have a new child, which is essentially the new personality in some sense, unless it's actually just a kind of a new bastard of a new false ego, but potentially. If someone is promulgating this activity as a so people who know of this mechanism and who are using it cynically, or using it, let's say, strategically, I wonder about the kind of paradoxical morality that would be spun out of such a instrumentalization of psychology. And I would say that that could also essentially be described as probably something like a Keegan stage 2. Things are going to be, in some sense, the only way to properly plug out of the false ego complex is to develop a kind of meta-morality in which one is actually grounded in principles and can have those principles correspondent or parallel to one's own subconscious, which is directly participating in the participation in principles. And so there is a realm of principled thinking and standards which is segregated out of the general unconsciousness of the world, and let's say the collective unconscious, that you have to banish concepts like the collective unconscious as being cognitively viable constructs for sound hypothesis, or in some sense that they, a better way, sorry, that's a slightly sloppy way of stating it, but a better way of stating it is that they negate self-coherence. And if you don't realize that they negate self-coherence, then and that's the most sort of broad and abstract way I can sort of frame it, but obviously that's going to have that how I've just abstractly framed it is going to have an infinite array of permutations or such. Or particular ways in which a narrative has been spun that performs that function. Was there anything? I wanted to say more things about the unconscious. I wanted to talk about the water. Did I already go into this? This is quite a touchy issue. I wanted to make a more robust thesis about the blood and the water and the spirit. It is hard to explain because it ends up through the Holy Ghost sort of breaking time and therefore breaking incarnation, and then it kind of seems self-referencing and tautological, because in some way, if you look at it from the perspective of the Holy Ghost, which you really can't, you can't look at it from this perspective because you can only live inside the Holy Ghost. You can't take on the Holy Ghost perspective. In some sense, you could say that when the Spirit moves one, in some sense, the choice is being made to include the blood of some and exclude the blood of others. In some sense, the embodiment of the Spirit in the water of some and the exclusion of the embodiment of the Spirit in the water of some or others. But in some sense, the spirits that are excluded are never, because in some sense the Spirit is the most basic. So in some sense, you can't really tell if water is fundamentally ambiguous, and in some sense, no, that's actually saying too much. I mean, perhaps it's not ambiguous. The problem is that testing the clarity of it is I think the problem is that it is fundamentally, they even call it the gut feeling. Your own view of your own soul is what the water is. So you will always have some view of your own soul, and it will always amount to the witness of the Trinity from your subjective perspective. And in some sense, it will be seemingly populated by your incarnated environment and your, and your lived experience will be the contents and the ingredients of that internal metaphor and interface, but you don't inherit the water, although it can be modeled in the surroundings that you have, that then you can craft from that model how it is witnessed by you. And in some sense not keeping the water distinct from the water of the world and the water of your internal self-determinism. I mean, that is perhaps an error that has to be at some point self-learnt by blaming oneself for making that error. Holding oneself accountable for that, because that is in some sense the root of self-coherence, in some sense that allows then one to move forward with a kind of epistemic agency, because one knows that one has kept oneself accountable for it in the past, and so one has not judged others first, one has judged oneself first, and contends that measure up to others so as also to have a basis of a shared understanding in which there can be respect for distinct objects of different identities or different people, even if they might share or potentially also disagree on understandings. So I guess the status of the water needs to be capable of being communicated, but also capable of being kept within a personal purview and control. How does one have trust in the water? It's more the converse. How does the water, or is the metaphor of trust in the water, or the interface of trust for the water? Position of trust will have a particular kind of support from a metaphorical system of the water. But a particular kind of water is, or anything like that, is so far, the water is so basic relative to trust. It's more like in some sense, you're already past the salt, never mind the water, you're already in some kind of salty water thing in the realm of trust has to do with ten, 9, 8. Trust has to do with blood. Water has to do that's the difference, is that trust has to do with blood. That's the distinguishing point, is that because trust has to do with blood, it's bound up around the Holy Ghost, essentially. It's these things are only reconciled in relation to the Holy Ghost, which means that it doesn't get whereas or it doesn't get spoken for, essentially, to any kind of trust is alive within the broader ambit and the more basic discerning of hope and a hopefulness. So hopefulness has a trust. So it's already in the action of hope, whereas the water, which is again is being contended by the blood, so what is the water doing? The witness of the water is the word. Sorry. The record of the water is the word, the record of the blood is the Holy Ghost, and the record of the Spirit is the Father. But because the Trinity are one, these three are also somewhat interchangeable. Perhaps they're not interchangeable, but they translate. What was I speculating is that the water how does the water conceive of trust? It's too basic to conceive of the activity of trust other than just the actual rough category or outline, that the thing exists in some sense. There is a general essentially that there is a space for it to exist and operate, that there is a valid realm for it. What also do you do with, can you trust realms? Can you trust compartments and containers and categories, or they're not? Again, this is the, in some sense, seems to be the combination of trust and Is that the juxtaposition to some degree, that you become unconscious of the superego's child function because you become extra conscious of managing the subconscious dominant function? And that is what revives the sin of the last side of the mind into being repurposed as the child function of that local side of the mind for the local dominant function. That is how the subconscious came into an emergence. A framework that was crafted in some sense by the devolution of the superego. Something that was managed by the parent function of the superego, which is effectively the tree of life, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I take it that the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the same tree, but it has been eaten of with a different intention. I wonder, is there an original integration? What would that model be? I remember speculating a long time ago in my notes that the subconscious is the key to so many things. That the stimulus, it's all about the stimulus. If you can just unravel the stimulus, but you have to know so much more broadly to settle the subconscious. But essentially the subconscious was the first and perhaps is the perennial thorn to be absolved and corrected. I need to come into describing how it came to be, how it emerged in the first place. And that's when I talk about the secret devotion, because one has to, in some sense, the ego had to exist before the subconscious, but the ego didn't have an anchor, so you had to have a kind of a candidate ego, which was the future of the subconscious yet to be developed, had to be constructed in some sense via the superego's projection onto the ego. And then that figment, that hypothetical figment, became the original tutor for the subconscious emergence. So before there is a proper devotion, there is a secret devotion or a virtual devotion for the declaration of the subconscious to grapple onto. So in some sense, the truth is that the declaration is premised on a sham. That kind of got the ball rolling. But this might also be different for the different gunas, because I haven't been able to reverse engineer it, but I have the gunas in my models, in my metagram models, which I still have to outline how I empirically ascertained that aspect of it. It's much easier to see emotional tones and to spot them being used. but in some sense I think is a bit of a projection or a speculation. Oh, I think I did order them according to strength, that it seemed to me that certain individuals had different strengths of each side of the mind, but particularly they had different strengths of their, that they had a kind of epistemological pecking order of which circuits, which connections between which parent functions and which inferior functions, if I could put it like that, although sometimes I should maybe include dominant function and parent function, connected with which inferior functions, which of those were privileged above the others, which of those were prioritized above the other connections. Because between those different sets of connections, there seems to be a natural, that the integrity of some of those connections are held to be more important than other connections, and there also seems to be a general flow that I seem to have observed, that people would connect a certain parent function or dominant function to an inferior function, and then they would springboard and do another one, but it wouldn't be, in some sense, because we're dealing with two separate circuits here that are not interconnected with each other, but they do sort of overlap one another. They do kind of occupy, in a kind of tandem way, they occupy the same space, but it's like lighting up in different places in a weird sequence. It's jumping around, sort of tailoring itself into a holistic entity. And I wonder if that's because, in some sense, everything is just a pseudo question or a pseudo just itself. That there are only actually two actors in the whole false ego complex. But it's arguable how to describe which those two actors are. The one actor is perhaps the inferior function in the ego, connected with the unconscious's dominant and parent function. And the other is the superego's foundation, child, dominant, and parent. Which could either be summarized either as just the child function, since it's the only thing that actually that contains a positive value, or it could be averaged out as the foundation of the superego, or it could be averaged out as its apex, the parent function of the superego, which I take also to be essentially the obscured tree of life that is hidden there. And the dominant function of the superego is also essentially the New Jerusalem, which is concealed by the great city of Babylon the Great, that is made up of the blood of the saints, waiting to be reclaimed. Well, it's sort of drenched in the blood of the saints, the superego's dominant function. And so everything is happening around the superego and the ego. I wonder if also you could also make a thematic correlation that the superego's child function is in some sense like the subconscious, and the superego's dominant function is like the unconscious, and the superego's parent function is like the ego. And the average of all three of these things is the foundation of the superego, which, you could call the terminal beast, or it is the sin of the ego, but also the foundation of the superego, as it is dead. It is the death, the prime death, that needs to be brought to life, which in some sense is between the child function and the inferior function. And I was talking so much about bringing the child function out of its timelessness. But yeah, that is, I think, the project, so as to make you capable of being able to move and operate over that prime death, as it were. So fighting over that, but yeah, that's sort of the final boss, as it were, the last act, or of in terms of self-actualization. Okay, anyway, I guess I've done enough about this. Let me stop this recording. Okay, I'm just going to try to make this recording. It's going to be slightly erratic, going through a list of metaphysical issues. I've spoken before, or I mentioned it in passing, that essentially why animals don't have sentience, or at least the other forms of life that are essentially don't have free will or don't have sentience, is because essentially that they don't have structures in their subconscious. I'd just like to expand on that using my psychological models. So essentially is that probably all animals, and in some sense this is a matter of description, this is not, and in some sense you can only describe it from the point of view of sentience or understanding. So it's a kind of, in some sense, to talk about the lack of sentience is a strange thing to try to sort of substantively ascribe an object, because sort of by definition it's what it lacks, or the particular dynamism or structure that it lacks. And so that's what I'm going to expand into. That it could be said that perhaps animals, therefore, in this weird hypothetical descriptive sense, have a naive subconscious, which in some sense also means that they have a naive unconscious, because that's what I'm about to expand into. That essentially what it means to have structures in your subconscious is that stable structures in the subconscious, which aren't perhaps just being projected there by the superego, is that the subconscious and the unconscious have a delineating, distinctive demarcation against one another. That the overlap between the subconscious and the unconscious is being actively regulated by the subconscious inferior function and the sin of the subconscious, which is obviously the child function of the unconscious. That in some sense the inferior function and perhaps although this isn't a mark of sentience, and in some sense animals can certainly be described as having this kind of feature, the action of the parent function within the subconscious, without the possibility of it being sensitive to the inferior function, in such a way that the inferior function has an overlapping footprint between the subconscious and the unconscious. It is the dual property of the inferior function that is in some sense structured within the parent function, and by extension, but also perhaps it could just be described as the structure of the dominant function in the subconscious. So the structure of the dominant function and the parent function, usually I conflate those two things into the parent function, but it could be, either structure could be described in both the dominant and the parent in a solitary framework. So you could either describe it as parent function or as dominant function structure, because one is going to have, by some account, a kind of parallel correlate to the other between the dominant and the parent. So the dominant function, or the parent function of the subconscious, is going to have a let's say a complicated relationship with the inferior function. And in some sense, the capability of self-deception is obviously, in some sense, the potential of actualized sentience. That, in some sense, or rather, perhaps I could just say sentience, because I define sentience as the capacity for free will and self-determinism, not the expression or the, it's a capability. It's not a metaphysical status, as it were. So, in some sense, the morally blameworthy thing that correlates to, what's the word? Like accountability or culpability is sentience. So it doesn't matter if you actually are using free will or not. You are blameworthy because you have the capacity, essentially, or you're culpable for your relegation of it, as it were. But and in some sense, there is a kind of bad faith on the subject matter of self-determinism, because essentially what is going to happen in people who are sentient, who are not actualizing their free will, is because they have essentially a convoluted structure in their dominant or parent function in their subconscious, which has a kind of paradoxical imprint of an unconscious structure. That's what the structure means. The structure is, in some sense, denoted by the interplay between the dominant or the parent and the inferior function. Now, in some sense, just structurally speaking, the unconscious seemingly has the upper hand, because it will always, generally speaking, have recourse to higher levels of dimensionality. It proceeds later from the subconscious. It comes, so it is above the subconscious, and to look at this metaphysically, you could say it's operating within, amidst the subconscious machinery. So in some sense, the unconscious is being hosted by the subconscious. Now, this is why animals are naive about these things, because they don't have any kind of structure of interplay. They might generate subconscious moods and feelings or associations. But the reason why, in some sense, these things can't be called beliefs that's going to be hard for me to try to trot out a philosophical distinction, I guess. Let me see if I can just use some low-level Platonism. You see, many people who don't have a proper actualization of self-determinism and free will would probably be able to say animals have beliefs. They would probably be able to make that ascription, essentially, because beliefs, in some sense, are kind of formulaically contentions which are propounded as the basis of like an experiential truth, or perhaps, I guess beliefs, even to these people, would extend into the deductive realm, but essentially inductive beliefs being, in some sense, just as Yeah, you see, the thing is that even the word belief presupposes the framework of a mind, and the framework of mind and consciousness, in some sense, which are perhaps missing from inductive, in some sense, what an animal might seemingly rely on in the regularity of their behavior, or some kind of habitual pattern, could be seen as an inductive recognition of a basic belief. But in some sense, this just, in some sense, if you reduce belief into a kind of a behaviorist metaphysic, or taken from a kind of behaviorist or materialistic philosophical worldview, then essentially you might as well ascribe animals as having beliefs, so long as they can perform regularly, seemingly problem-solving activities. But again, those problems are going to be apportioned by a mind that actually has the mental grammar, that can actually construct and consider alternative contentions in some kind of mental grammar. And I think that the thing that makes real beliefs possible is similar, but not exactly the same, as the thing that makes self-determinism possible, is that you have to essentially have a conception of the self in relation to the unconscious, and a conception of the self in relation to the subconscious, and essentially some kind of both bridge but demarcation and delineation between the two. And that contradistinction, in some sense, is the thing that essentially sentience is the prima materia of free will, and what is in fact the capacity of sentience. And this breeds perhaps some understanding to the creation story in Genesis chapter 1, where in some sense, when God made man, there are two creations. And I think that you could ascribe those two creations in the creation of man, one to the subconscious and one to the unconscious. The scripture reads something like, and in the image of God, oh my word, let me just look it up. It's not rolling off the tongue. It's something like, in the image of I think it's something like, and so God made man in his image. In the image of God made he him. In the male and female made he them. Oh my word, I'm forgetting it. It says so. So, it's interesting because all the other, it says, and God said, and God created. And then it said about man, it says, okay, or it does start off by saying and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. So what I mean about the two creations is that it says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. That's what I mean by the two creations. So God created man in his image. In the image of God created he him. the he, him, you see, is essentially the composite. So in the second creation, there's a composite. So the first creation, and so God created man in his image. That's the subconscious framework. In the image of God created he, him. That's the unconscious conception of the subconscious framework. He, him. Is not enough to actually create the thinking thing, but you have to create then within the thinking thing the conception, the self-conception, or another created image of the thinking thing, because essentially this is what, and you can see this. I mean, this is a strange esoteric way of framing it, but essentially, this is why you have to be worried, or you have to be concerned about grammatical constructs. What did he do? What is, when I say he, I mean, if you make a preposition in your mind and you start thinking about he, what do you say about him? What do you say about what he is doing? When you are referring to a he or a him within the mental realm of constructing things, what is the generic category of he and him? How are you treating the conception of a man, the constitution of the human mind? Because essentially what you ascribe to that in some sense is by definition a dual-edged sword, because it is in some sense the thing that both belief and self-determinism are all hinged on. And so, sort of basic, you can attack, and I mean, perhaps this is woven into some of the political stuff around feminism and things like that. But essentially, you can almost create a kind of systemic oppression ideology and cult just by creating accusations against the grammatical category of he and him, that essentially whatever you ascribe to that basic category, you are essentially inducting yourself into an ideological systemic oppression. Now, this is slightly more complicated because, man and he and him are all essentially seemingly masculine. I would argue that the category of he and him you see, you have to kind of take an alchemical hermetic view of these things, essentially, that because gender is essentially something like a psychological construct that that everyone is both spiritual male and soul female, essentially. And this is why in the semicolon it says male and female created he them, that the spirit and the soul is always a them, and he him is essentially a way of talking about the active part of the thinking, of the deciding, and essentially the her and herself is not mentioned here, because in some sense it is you don't need to mention something that is always, I mean, it's a prerequisite to being able to read the scripture, is that you have a soul. If you weren't a living soul, then there is no reading for you, so it doesn't make a difference. And in some sense, the soul is not spoken about because essentially the soul belongs to the he and the him. It belongs to God, belongs to the spirit. The soul belongs to the spirit. And so the spirit is the thing that we're actually concerned with, because essentially the soul is a given, as it were, or in any relevant sense, it's a given. And in some sense, the condition of the soul is constituted by the activity of the spirit, the activity of this self concept to some degree. Anyway, so this is what animals lack. And so they just have, by all accounts, a naive subconscious, which by definition in how I've just constructed this means that they have a naive unconscious. And when I say that, I mean almost to say that they have none of these things at all. We just kind of metaphorically might project these things onto them. And we can certainly have some spiritual communication with some animals, but it's that's a whole different sort of can of worms. I don't know if I want to enter into that subject matter at the moment, but let me think. Is there anything else I wanted to comment on this subject? The reason why I was just bringing this up is because I wanted to talk about noesis, which is a term that I came up with a teacher of mine. It's embarrassing, I can't remember his name, when I was in junior school. And he was quite a serious sort of teacher. He was teaching his whole life, and he's taught many university courses and things like that. And he came up with this word noesis, which is essentially the concept that in the development of a fetus, that essentially evolution in some form is being relitigated or renavigated, essentially. That, if you look at the development of a fetus, what you see is something at a certain time looks like a very basic form of life. And, it looks like it's actually going through evolution into the human form in some sense. If you ever, and that replay of evolution in some sense you can imagine that essentially the thing that allows us to have this thing about making culpable, blameworthy accountability, in having having the potential of sentience, or obviously any sort of human fetus is going to have the potential of sentience so long as it gestates up to the certain level at which essentially so I mean, you could say that there's a spirit of the potential of sentience, and then at some point the sentience actually has some kind of basic model or structure, which could be seen as essentially God creating the subconscious in his image and creating the image of God in the unconscious. Now, in some sense, this is, I should actually enlarge in what I was saying because it's slightly confusing, I guess. Because, what I've just read from Genesis could be regarded as purely metaphysical, or in some sense purely a priori in terms of kind of metaphysical categories. And in some sense, that is the point that it serves, is that there is this completely immaterial spiritual recognition or truth, that there is essentially a model of these basic objects which are fundamentally, you could call them sort of fundamental assumptions or axioms. And so if I transpose them onto saying, in the way that I just did, that the subconscious is created in the image of God, and the unconscious holds an image of that creation, is capable of holding that image. In some sense, for it to be capable of holding that image, in some implicit sense, in some indirect sense, it already does hold it, but only relative to the a priori sort of metaphysical framing, essentially. So this is the thing, is that you actually, let's say, the axiomatic preconditions for holding beliefs at all could also be said to be a belief of some kind in terms of how it's depended on, but essentially it's fundamentally prime. It is the engine of prime thought, which is, I'll just throw that out there, that links to a philosophical or a psychological thing discovered. It's spoken about in Scientology slightly, but that in its proper unadulterated sense, or let's say unfiltered by other beliefs, it can sort of generate a golden thread of self-determinism. And just because it can be confronted by obstacles or conditioning or conditionality, doesn't cheapen its ability to adopt what it has inherited from the world, as it were. So it can be overcome by what it inherits, but it can also freely choose to adopt what it also has inherited from the flesh, as it were. And so this is essentially, sort of which side do you fall on? Do you fall on essentially reducing everything into an equal contention of a belief structure that can never have a fundamental cornerstone, or never has a fundamental lever on which everything else can rest, or essentially what is spoken about in 1 John chapter 4, the Spirit of God. Which is essentially trying to magnify this golden thread and adopt the inheritance freely, which is also somewhat reminiscent of what is being explored in the technology of the crucifixion. Now, one of the things that is also weird about this is that what this golden thread of prime thought generates is somewhat inexhaustible, but it also is definitive. It's not indefinite. in its in the ability for it to provide a source or impetus for other beliefs or actions upon the mind. And that is worth noting because that is worth noting because sorry, I'm just trying to remember my thread now. Is that in some sense one could say that it is both locked up or held in some, the conservation of that in some objective sense, in some I must try to understand what these people say when they use these words interpersonal and transpersonal, because in some sense I think that they use it in a very sloppy way because their philosophical worldview in some senses being completely obscured by just using terms that seem to have issues like this sorted out. But essentially what I'm trying to get to the point of is that the Holy Ghost is going to have a direct interface with this golden thread in some sense. And this is the problem of the Holy Ghost, and why the Holy Ghost is also necessary, is because in some reductive sense you could relegate all of life and living between people into a kind of blood sport or a blood game, in which essentially decisions that are made at some point in time may or may not have future implications on what other blood is then shed and what other blood is then included, or something like that. What blood is redeemed and what blood isn't redeemed, or something like that. You can kind of create a kind of blood utilitarianism, and in some sense the only way to get away from that essentially is to have the idea that one just contents oneself with the spirit and not the soul, and that the Holy Ghost will conserve the soul as it will conserve the blood, and one deals only with one's proper truth, as it were, which is something like this prime thought. And that does mean that you do contend in an arena that does contend within an arena that does have a possible I've heard people use this phrase, I might be butchering it, combinatorial explosion. But that doesn't mean that you're using a heuristic or some ad hoc heuristic to curb that. The Holy Ghost is not an ad hoc heuristic. And in some sense, somewhat the promise is that everyone that is dealing with it in one-to-one in the same relationship. But it means something completely differently when witnessed by the water and the blood of the particular individual to some degree. But I mean, in some sense, that I can't even say that. But it's different in the water and in the blood, but it shouldn't be different in the spirit, in the discerning, in the mind, in the quality of the understanding of it. And that is something that we can essentially share. And essentially the skepticism against that, because you can't jump the ought is divide or something like that, is in some sense obscuring the basic psychological reality that, or the basic phenomenological conundrum of not relenting into a materialist reductionism, or at least not relenting into epistemic reliabilism, but having an epistemic agency and an epistemic responsibility. And that then obviously opens the door to essentially the necessity to having faith be a part of relationships and culture even, and not just managing and maximizing behavioristic utilitarian good, which will also be an aggravating and, I would argue, have a deleterious effect. I mean, all fascism always just proselytized that they were maximizing the good, but it came at such cost. And in some sense, the other kind of utilitarian maximizers come at the cost of essentially having a stable, soft cultural faith in a culture of integrity. Essentially, they maximize trust at the cost of integrity, which becomes essentially I don't know how to describe it, but essentially becomes a dangerous and perhaps a spiraling, people that try have a high trust society that doesn't have a high integrity society ends up like probably, sort of in how it's envisioned that the dinosaurs became extinct, that they became specialized, and then they just kind of go into a cul-de-sac, the sort of that straight line progress that doesn't sort of come back to itself, that doesn't, that's not sort of sustainable within its own reasoning. It's just a kind of rationalization doubling down. I wanted to make some political points as well, but I'll rather make that on a different recording, I guess. But no, I will conjoin it to this. I think it is a little bit relevant. I mean, you can see it, identity politics is exactly the same as this COVID apartheid kind of thinking, where, people, they almost have an emotional argument, and they have never substantiated their case. There has not been a proper debate. It's such a censored debate, where these measures have never been properly substantiated. In some sense, we've lost the liberal, our journalists have been radicalized by identity politics. It's really quite disgusting. They are used to peddling narratives and identifying scapegoats for the systemic oppression and finding ways to vent political pressure, essentially, or psychological pressure, which is sort of hinged on finding a scapegoat. But it's very interesting how they just award themselves the orthodoxy, and they just kind of have enough people chipping in to support the narrative. They just have we really do need a kind of a new enlightenment to put all these very bad fascistic ways of thinking to bed. But let me try to substantiate some of the claims that I've just made now, I guess. But essentially, the idea that you can just conflate problems into a readily available scapegoat, which then you can vilify, and then you just assume that you're on the right side and that and that the orthodoxy is with you for good reason, essentially, like that. But it's just a constructed narrative, and it's never been properly substantiated. And the actual standards for a liberal order and a liberal society doesn't have enough rigor to actually contend against, the rule of law was essentially lax. There's so few places that actually even have the rule of law on paper. There's only one to my mind. But anyway, and we don't have the rule of law in practice because it's been diminished. by an ideological political narrative that essentially is completely hinged on scapegoating things. And so policies and decency. What was I going to say? Yeah, it's disgusting that now robust debate is used almost euphemistically by these identity politics journalists to mean essentially touting fascistic ways of moral conflating issues. Robust debate means saying things that are abjectly racialistic, and which is essentially what racism is a racialism. Your sort of basic moral categories have been completely dissolved and reconstructed around a systemic oppression way of interrogating politics and any issue, which essentially drives one towards creating more and more rationalizations for essentially creating double standards, which is what you do when you are conflating problems into scapegoats, and you're creating categories which have not been properly morally substantiated through proper principles. And so once you have these easy, quick fix, one-size-fits-all solutions in some case, then you never have to do the work of substantiating anything. And you can just keep on creating more rationalizations to vilify the people who obstruct you or countermand your narrative. So, it's a kind of a complete sort of mind control. And this is the recipe of unclean government and unclean, unprincipled. It doesn't have the moral coherence that it can actually sustain accountability within its structure, because it's so ravenous to apportion the blame on the ideological scapegoat or on the bad guy of the narrative, on the perpetrator. And in some sense, the thing that it defines as evil, or that it uses as the representative of the problem, is essentially a morally invalid category to use. It's an illiberal scapegoat. It's an illiberally framed way of scapegoating a problem. And this is the I mean, it really, if you want to call something the mark of the beast, I mean, this is something that essentially is to completely undermine the basic image of authority, the image of God, the image of reason, the image of a mind that has self-determinism, that has the liberty and responsibility for its own epistemic agency. This is the relegation of all agency into a conditioning of a systemic oppression with a systemic narrative. With using these morally filthy objects and turning people into these sort of ravenous miscreants, going around and causing havoc and trying to create a kind of psychological feeding frenzy. Because this is basically the worldview of the of the collectivization of responsibility onto the narrative, onto the soul. So therefore, essentially, that they need a representative of the Holy Ghost. They need an authorized God of the world to come and to be the Führer of the system, to be the savior of their narrative. They don't want to develop the spiritual, mental self-coherence. And so this is a perennial theme. You see it in many different ways all over the place. And in some sense, it is some kind of paradox between the subconscious and the unconscious, which so much, that's sort of Keegan stage 3.5 to, I generally regard the unconscious as being Keegan stage 3, and the subconscious Keegan stage 2, the unconscious Keegan stage 3, the ego Keegan stage 4. And when you have those things nicely integrated, then you're at that. And then, anyway, when you integrate, in my view, Keegan stage 4 and Keegan stage 1, then the superego and the ego, that together could be said to be Keegan stage 5. But anyway, that's just to parallel that with Keegan's work. But anyway, let me stop this recording. I think I've gone on enough and made all the points that I wanted to make. But yeah, I mean, essentially what we're boiling in is the juvenile immaturity, psychological immaturity, because we have culturally lost our way quite heavily. But anyway.